Hello, you beautiful people in Webtown. We are LIVE
The Calgary
live.
Zoo is now open.
Okay. Let's go for it. Okay, we're live now.
We are live already,
Okay.
Bob. I just figured people
Sean
should
thought
see
that
the
was funny.
shit
I
show
don't-
we have to deal with.
Okay.
Bruce owns 13 dogs, 27 cats, a couple donkeys, and he had to get them all out of the house.
Anyway, hi guys. Hi Matt and Sean, and this is Bob Johnson, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and welcome to the Hart Beat here with Sean and Matt this evening. We have an incredible guest this evening, a dear friend of mine. He's one of the greatest heel managers of all time with the Four Horsemen. He's got a tremendous wrestling. A tremendous wrestling career himself. Just give you a few highlights. I talked to a dear friend of mine the other day, Brian Blair, who was telling me, I was telling him that I have JJ on the show this week, and remember in 2007, the Cauliflower Alley Club inducted JJ into the Cauliflower Alley Club, and rousing applause. A little bit later, JJ was inducted into the George Thregos Luthez Professional Hall of Fame in 2016, and the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2013, and the WWE Hall of Fame in 2012. So, what can you say about the great JJ Dillon? Welcome, JJ, and great to be on this evening. And I'll have Bruce join us in a few minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I hear you great.
Wow,
Everybody hears you great.
what an intro! I'm lost for words, and that doesn't happen very often. Thank you for that introduction. It just what that means is that I'm old and I've been around the business a long time, which is true too. I mean, I started when I was like 16 years old with a fan club for Johnny Valentine, and I was a huge fan, and I'm still a fan to this day. And I've been fortunate to a lot of people know me as the leader of the Four Horsemen, which was I'm sure the highlight of my career. But my active wrestling career was 20 years, and a lot of people, unless they've done any research, don't know that I had like 3,200 professional wrestling matches. Spent a year wrestling in Australia, and a month in New Zealand, all going in, and a month coming back. I wrestled in Germany, I think 44 of the states, 15 tours of Japan. So I've been very, very fortunate to be able to travel the world, and a lot to be thankful for with the business.
And you have an amazing collection of memorabilia, JJ. I first saw this in the documentary 350 Days, and I wish they would have spent some more time just getting a tour of your home there.
Yeah, I have a lot of memories up here, and it's surprising at quiet moments, without the TV on. I look around the room, and these are my memories, and I'm very very thankful for it. I would like to say too, as I'm doing this interview, that it's with a bit of a heavy heart, because we've lost a couple people. One of which was somebody who I first met in Japan, probably 1975. He wrestled for All Japan Giant Baba, and I'm referring to Kazuo Sakurada, who was better known later on when he came here, when I managed him as Kendo Nagasaki. And sadly, Kendo passed away this week, only 61 years old. He was in his sleep, and I don't have much details coming from Japan other than they said there was some complication with his pacemaker, which that got my attention, because I have a pacemaker, and whatever the problem was, I hope I don't ever have that same problem. And then the other thing this week was I heard the passing of Mr. Wrestling 2 from Hawaii, who was in his 90s, had a good life, and I had a chance to wrestle him and be around him a lot. And so there were two people that that we lost.
We also lost one this morning. Barb Armstrong's wife passed away this morning.
I'm sorry, who was that?
Bob Armstrong's wife passed away this morning.
Sorry to hear that. I know Bob too well.
Okay, I guess we want to.
I don't want to start the show out on a downer, but I did want to draw attention to the loss of Kendo Nagasaki and Wrestling 2, because both of them were to me were icons in our profession, and I don't think it would be fair to do a show and not pass condolences to each of them's family and loved ones, especially that I work with both of them.
Absolutely.
Bruce, you got to unmute yourself, buddy. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
I hear you too.
Yeah, what did Sakurada pass away from, JJ?
The only thing they said was a complication with his pacemaker, and he passed away in his sleep. And they said there was some complication or problem, which I would like to know, because I have a pacemaker, and it's a device that sits next to the bed and charges it. And I have something that was installed. I can put my hand up on my left shoulder. If you see me here, it's right up here. It's just a small lump under my skin where it was implanted in there. And there's a wire that goes direct into my heart, and it reach every night. It's on my nightstand, the base of it, and it recharges itself. And I was told that I could go away for as long as a week or more, and the charge will last. It's like I have to take the device with me. So I'm always alarmed when I hear that somebody has a pacemaker, and which was with Sakurada. They said he had one and had a complication with it, whatever that means.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Yeah. JJ, you wrestled Bobby Heenan quite a few times, didn't you, over your career?
I don't know that I ever actually wrestled against Bobby. I was around Bobby a lot. To me, I'm best remembered for my managerial career, but I always regard Bobby Heenan as the greatest manager in the history of our business. And anytime that I would talk to Nick Bockwinkel, he was very close with Bobby too, and which I totally agree with. He said that as an actual accomplished wrestler, Bobby was as good as there was. And Bockwinkel told me that up in Minneapolis, when he and Stevens were a hot team up there, if something happened to one of them with an injury or something, that Bobby could step in and take the place in the actual match. And Bockwinkel went so far as to say that Bobby was not only a great manager, a great talker, great storyteller, joke teller, but as a performer in the ring, there were none better than him. And I've seen Bobby in the ring and would have to agree to that.
Wow, but you guys never got to wrestle each other.
No, I don't. I kept a book of all my, which I don't refer back to that often, but for tax purposes, when I actually started my career, there was a book called Week at a Glance. It's one of these things right here, and it's just a book that has a week for the whole year. And for tax purposes, I would write down if I was going to a town, where it was, if I flew, going to the airport and what the fare was, if I drove, how many miles it was, if there were tolls, and I would then write on there if I actually physically wrestled, who my opponent was. And if I managed, I just put manage. And at the end of the year, when it came time to do taxes, it was like an instant guide that took me about an hour to go through it page by page with a blank sheet of paper, and I could, write down, how much money I was paid and get a total for the year to pay taxes. And in that way, it was kind of like an informal diary of all my travels around the world. And I fortunately would take the book at the end of the year and do my taxes, but then I threw it in a briefcase, and I have all those books going back to the beginning of my career.
Wow, that's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah. Because I've traveled, like, that's how I know I had over 3,200 matches. And I lived and wrestled in Australia for a year, with a month in New Zealand on the way over and back. I made like 15 tours of Japan, all for All Japan Wrestling with Giant Baba. So I, wrestled Baba, wrestled Sakurada in the beginning over there because he was a young boy with Baba. And then, of course, the Destroyer. And then here in the States, I wrestled, like I say, and I was keeping track of how many states I wrestled in, and I think I got up to 44 of the 52. So I got a chance to travel a lot.
Wow.
So what, one more year and then you're going to officially retire, or?
You don't never retire from this business. But I had a chance to. I just was looking through the other day, and one of the true legends of all time from Mexico was the original El Santo. I wrestled El Santo. I had 2 matches with him in my career. One when he came over, they brought him over. The Funks did for a booking in El Paso, and then the night before on Sunday they had him in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was in a tag match both nights with El Santo and Ricky Romero in a tag match. So very fortunate that in making a list of all the people I've been in the ring with, I can include the original El Santo.
Wow.
Yeah, he was in his 60s at the time, but boy, he could. I don't want to make light of it, but what I do remember is Santo. His finish was he would slam you like in the middle of the ring, and then he would go out and scamper up to the top turnbuckle, and he would do a diving head bomb onto you, and as he would hit you kind of like Harley Race, only he would hit you with his head, and then his body would go over you. He would pivot around and then hook your leg and pin you. And I remember Dory and Terry Funk both telling me, because they had El Santo, and they said when he slams you, and of course I have no control of where he slams me. I could scoot a little bit, but he would slam me in the middle of the ring, and he would climb up the top turnbuckle. And Dory and Terry told me, whatever you do, if you have to try and catch his head on the way down and guide him to you, God forbid, please don't ever have a situation where his neck was broken working for the Funks. So I had 2 matches, one in Phoenix and then one in El Paso, and both went well. And it's nice to be able to say that I wrestled the original El Santo.
I was going to ask you, JJ, when did you first go down and do the Four Horsemen thing? Was that your idea, or who was the kind of the guy who planned that? And if you could give us just a little perspective on that, what made it so successful, and just a little bit of kind of history on it.
Yeah, modern people that, unless they're really students of the business, don't know that I wrestled actively for 20 years and had 3,200 matches and held major titles. They just know me as pretty much the leader of the Four Horsemen. And it was something that we were doing TBS TV every week. And of course that with Cablevision, because Ted Turner loved wrestling, and once he had wrestling on there and you were on that program, you not only went national everywhere, which was unusual because basically wrestling was built on, probably 25 different territories, but now you were on national exposure, and then it became international exposure. And we did an interview one time. which sometimes in TBS they would have like 2-minute time slots. And if you were going to a venue that week to wrestle, you could mention off of the TBS show that you were going to be in whatever the town it was in the country. They weren't everywhere. And if you had no live events that week, then that was a 2-minute slot that you pretty much had to just improvise and fill the time and hopefully make it interesting. And so I was there with Dusty was the booker at the time, and I was his assistant, and it ended up that one of the 2-minute slots, they really didn't have anything that had any thing specific to talk about, no upcoming big events or big matches, and the Horsemen were all there. So Dusty said to all, he says, you guys just go out as a group. The Four Horsemen is a big deal. Just all of you go out there together. And we went out, and it was only 2 minutes. And the beauty, one of the beautiful things about the Horsemen was, and I've been in circumstances where, whether it's even just a simple 2-man team, and you somehow get in a situation with an interview where one guy gets on a roll about some specific thing, and a lot of times the partner doesn't really get a chance to say anything other than stand there and nod his head or whatever. And some guys, that really bothered them if they were on the interview and never got to say anything, which didn't bother me. But we went out there, and it was all of us, and we didn't have any town to plug or anything. And Arn carried the load. Because he could talk about anything and everything and make the interview interesting. And on that particular interview, he said, and it was Flair, it was Tully, it was Arn, and it was Barry Windham and myself. All Dusty said, all of you just go out and whatever you guys want to talk about. Well, Arn started it and carried the thing, and the rest of us stood there, which was unusual for a 2-minute interview with Flair there, and Flair never said anything. And one of the things that Arn said, he said, you people at home, take a good look at your television screen, because he said, you're looking at 4 individuals, and they regarded me as the 5th horseman, but it was the 4 horsemen, and I was the leader. And he said, take a good look. And he said, you are looking at 4 icons of the business that are all successes in their own right, all have an individual reputation as a champion. And he said, collectively, the 4 horsemen, he didn't even say 4 horsemen at that point. He said, take a look at this group. And he said, never have a group of athletes dominated the profession like the group that you're looking at on your screen now. And he said, trying to draw a comparison somewhere, he said, the only thing I can think of is, he said, is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And he held up 4 fingers. And it just was because Arn always just was very creative with his thinking, and nobody really thought anything of it. And we used to do the TV show in the morning at TBS that would go nationally at 6:00. Then we would get on a plane to some town, whether it was up in Ohio, Greensboro, whatever. And that particular night we were in Greensboro, and I remember going to the ring, and the whole first row of ringside were all dressed up with shirts and ties, and it was a bunch of young guys there wasn't a show of disrespect. It's just, they all when we all got there, they all stood up and they all held up 4 fingers, and the whole building then turned around and did the same. And that it grew from that. And from there, everywhere that we ever went, we went to buildings, and it still amazes me that I'll go to buildings I've never been to, and I've been to outdoor stadiums where after we were inducted into the Hall of Fame in Orlando, we went out and did a stadium show. There's 60,000 people there, and we walked out on the stage, and you look up and you couldn't see the people in the far distance, but you could see the people towards the end. And I remember looking up and seeing fans hold up what was known as the symbol of excellence. And I thought, wow. And Jimmy Crockett wasn't even aware for a couple of weeks. He said, what is it? What is this? I said, Jimmy, you better pay attention, because Arn on an interview drew a comparison to us. And the only thing he could compare it to was something beyond the wrestling world, which was the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and held up the four fingers. And he said, that's what they're doing everywhere we go. They're holding the fans, because they can't get up and talk to you necessarily. But one thing they can do, whether they're sitting up in the stands or sitting 10 rows back in ringside, they can stand up and hold up the four fingers. And that's what happened. And that's what it grew from. And we have to give full credit to that, to Arn Anderson.
Now, JJ, we got a couple of, what's unique about doing this show on YouTube is that you actually get to have the fans interact with you in the chat over on the right-hand side of the screen. And I just like to read these every once in a while. Ricky Donna says, JJ Dillon and Bobby Heenan are the two greatest managers who could also work better than most wrestlers.
Wow, that's a great compliment. I felt that way about Bobby Heenan, and I know that, like I say, Bockwinkel, Nick Bockwinkel told me, he said when he and Stevens were together, they were tag champions in California and in Minneapolis, and if one of them got hurt, Bockwinkel told me, he said if Ray got hurt or couldn't be here or something, Bobby could put the tights on and go in the ring. And he said of the three of us, he could outwork us all. And so Bobby just was that talented, and his interviews were unique. He was funny without being funny. And that's why anytime that somebody talks about great managers and mentions my name, I'll always interrupt them and say, yes, but the greatest manager of all time was Bobby the Brain Heenan.
Wrestling Legacies says, hi, Mr. Dillon. During this quarantine, I had the pleasure of reading your book. Very good.
Oh, thank you.
What is your book?
I was published in, Scott Teal had done Ole Anderson's autobiography, and then approached me about writing my life story. And I had never even thought about it. And at that point I said, well, I don't know that I could come up with enough stuff to fill a book. And he said, no, he said, you have to give yourself credit. He said, you've had a storied career and done it all. And this was like 2005. And it was a project that took close to a year. And it started as a chronological thing, which would have been very boring if you read it like a diary. But it's like, where did you start? How did you break into business? And who were your first matches with? And we would go year to year to year, and we would have 2-hour phone conversations. And Scott Teal has a tremendous knack for then taking all of those interviews and putting them down in writing in chapter form, where he would create subjects. And it was my life, and not because it was my life, but I was interested in reading it because that's the skills that Scott Teal has. And that's how my book came to be. And like I say, that was in 2005. Wrestlers Are Like Seagulls. And the original hardcover was only 3,000 copies. And I have the first copy that I kept for myself, but all the rest got sold out within 30 days. And it's been reprinted umpteen times. And it really is. It's the story of my life, of a 16-year-old kid from Trenton, New Jersey, that discovered I was a big Brooklyn Dodger fan and baseball. And the Dodgers in '58 up and left Brooklyn and went to California, and broke my heart. And the Giants followed them. The Yankees stayed here, and that's what drew my attention to professional wrestling. It used to be on every Thursday night for 2.5 hours with Ray Morgan. And that was the era of Rocca and Buddy Rogers, Chief Big Heart, Haystacks Calhoun, Bobo Brazil, all these bigger than life characters that and I wasn't even old enough to drive. And my first live event was when they came to Trenton, New Jersey, where I was born and raised. To get to the show, my mother had to take me because I wasn't old enough to drive. I think I was 16. And I went to that first live show, and I was hooked from there. I realized that this was my passion, and it is to this day, all these years later.
If you don't mind my asking, JJ, how are wrestlers like seagulls or what? I was intrigued.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. I knew where that came from. I worked for. I haven't told the story very often, so this may be a first. But I worked for. I knew when I was in college, I was around Vince McMahon Sr., who took a personal liking to me, treated me. God, he was wonderful to me. And of course, Junior came along after that, and then took their business to new heights. And I know for a fact that Vince McMahon Sr., with all the old timers back in those days, I'm talking about Jay Strongbow and all those they adored Vince McMahon Sr. He was like a father figure to all of those guys, and they talked about him with so much respect. And when the son came along and Vince Jr. bought the company, bought the business from his father, it wasn't handed to him, and he took it globally and made it bigger than ever. But he was never endeared to the wrestlers, especially the old timers, like his father was. And it just, and I can't explain why, other than his father was a very, very special individual. And like I say, treated me so well when I was nobody. I was a college kid, and he was a wonderful man.
Well, we have someone else joining us here. If she would unmute herself, she can speak freely. The lovely and vivacious Barbara Goodish. Barbara, your mic is muted, but
I don't see her picture either. I'd like to see Barbara.
I know she needs to turn on her camera and her mic. There we go. There's a mic.
There's a mic. Now we need the camera, Barbara.
Hello?
Oh,
There it is.
All right. the beautiful Barbara Goodish. It's good. Yeah.
My goodness.
It's good that you just came on, because the rest of us would have been ignored once they saw you.
I just wanted to come on, JJ, and surprise you, tell you happy birthday. And,
Thank you. I did have a birthday. Let's see, what's today? It's the 26th. I had a birthday on the 26th.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I first met Barbara. I always thought that once I got a chance to break into the business, I would never in my own mind have felt that, okay, you finally made it, other than going into the ring for the first time and having a match. I had three things that were my criteria in my mind before I could finally say, I'm a legitimate professional wrestler. I made it. And the three things were to go to Australia, because back in the day, all of the big name stars made tours of Australia, going back when Barnett pioneered it, and it was a big deal. And the guys that went there were stars in the business. And the other thing was to go to Japan, that the better wrestling talent got a chance to go either through Inoki or Giant Baba, which were the two major companies, to wrestle in Japan. And the third criteria in my own mind was I never would have felt that I actually made it until I myself could say I wrestled in Madison Square Garden. And I got a chance to go to Australia, which is where I met Barbara for the first time. I finally got to go over there with Bruce Bernard, and Barbara was over there, and you were, if I remember right, you were leaving with Frank to come to the States. And so that's the first memory of you, of having met you. And I want to, does 1980 sound about right? Something like that. It was a long time ago.
It was 1978 when we met.
Oh my goodness. We won't tell anybody because people could start adding up and figure out how old.
Oh gosh.
But no, it was, God, such great memories, really. So I've known Barbara since 1978. That's okay.
Whoa. Please don't add up the time. That's just a little too much for 42 years.
What I will say, the years have been a lot tougher on me than they have on you. You look great.
Oh.
And at least I'm still here.
Well, this is what I say. Look at us. So we're all still here. Even with everything going on, we're still here. And that's the main thing.
Yeah. And it's like I said earlier at the beginning, I'm saddened because we don't all live forever, but every time that we lose somebody from our fraternity, because I've traveled the world and I think that I probably have met or been around or worked with virtually everybody in the profession, and to have lost Kazuo Sakurada, who was Kendo Nagasaki, to get that news was terrible because he was only 61 years old and died of a complication with his in his sleep with the pacemaker, some kind of a malfunction. And in the morning he had passed that night. And the other one was wrestling too, Johnny Walker, who passed away this week, who in Hawaii, who was in his 90s. John had a good life, and I wrestled him countless times, a lot in Florida. And I think the handprint from that big knee, I probably still have that permanently on my back. Where the big knee was the big thing, but if you were ever in the match with him, the thing that hurt the most was that simultaneously slap across your back as he hit you with that knee. But John was he was a great credit to our business, and sad to hear of his passing. But like I say, anytime you get to live in your 90s, you've had a good life.
Exactly. And
JJ, we have a question in the chat about Florida. When you performed in Jacksonville, do you remember what your favorite venue to eat at was?
Wow. In Jacksonville. I'm drawing a blank. I know Jacksonville was like, I remember right, a Thursday town, and it was a part of a weekly schedule, and we would go there Thursdays. But I don't remember. Obviously, somebody in Jacksonville must have said that there was a regular stop that I went to.
They should have dropped the hint.
Yeah, give me a hint. Give me a hint.
I think Bruce wants to say something here. Bruce, you got to unmute yourself.
Oh, good. I'm not the only one.
There you go.
Are you on now?
There you go, Bruce.
Yeah. When you first went to WWE, and was it '89? Did you leave on good terms from WCW, or what was the? How did that kind of transpire?
I've been very lucky all of my life. If I work for a promotion, doesn't matter who it is, and they're the people who sign my check each week and are affording me a living, all of my energy, all of my focus and everything is in support of my time with that particular promotion and making it be as memorable as possible. And when you have like the WWE with Vince McMahon, and you had WCW, like when Eric Bischoff was there, they were both trying to be dominant forces in the industry. And all I wanted to do, if I was there, if I was working for one or the other, and I spent about 7 years as vice president of talent relations with Vince McMahon. And then when I went to WCW, I had the same responsibility and the same title. So I had good success, and the only thing that I did was to put all my energy into whatever. I never looked at, once I went to WCW, I didn't look at the WWE television on that that given week. It was like I just put all of my energy and focus into what I was doing with whoever I was working with, and making my time there be the best that it could be. And it never became a personal thing where, you know, you like somebody one day and then you're working for another promoter and all of a sudden you're supposed to hate the one. I left. I feel. I mean, in this business, you don't know. Sometimes you can create enemies or hurt feelings with people that you're not even aware of, and it might have been something that certainly wasn't intentional. Because when you work at the upper level in responsibility or management, it's a very competitive business, and there's a lot of guys who. You know, everybody wants to get to the top, but not everybody can be at the top. And there's guys who feel, because I've heard of it secondhand, that, you know, somebody wasn't happy because they said you held them back, or which I never deliberately did that. I was given opportunities myself, and I always wanted to give the other people opportunities. But whoever I was working with, I wanted the product to be the absolute best that it could be. So, like I say, I think the greatest test is the test of time. And I spent 7 years as a vice president of talent relations with the WWE and Vince McMahon, and then the same title for a 7-year period with Ted Turner's organization.
So you said that you, obviously, from what I can tell, I would say that to you, Australia was probably one of the dearest places of all your travels. What made Australia and the wrestling so huge back then?
I think Australia first got its reputation when Jim Barnett went down there, and they never had professional wrestling, and he introduced it on TV, and because it was new, it took Australia by storm. And Barnett did very well financially. In fact, he did so well financially that the reason that he finally had to he sold his interest to a guy who had a series of laundromats named Tony Kalani, and Ron Miller and Larry O'Day were two Australian wrestlers that had been to the United States as a tag team and were very polished wrestlers. And in Australia, if you had a business and you were earning money in Australia, you had to have at least partial ownership by somebody who was Australian. And so that's how Miller and O'Day got their interest, was because they were two of the top guys, and they were given points in the business by Barnett so as to fulfill that thing to have local ownership. But I spent a year there, just incredible memories. One of my favorite places in the world. I had an apartment in Sydney at King's Cross down the hill, and it's a melting pot of a lot of Italian people, a lot of Greek people. So the food there is just incredible restaurants, incredible food, and just the Australian people were wonderful people. That they loved Americans. Because I was an American, they treated me so well, because they all hoped that someday and all the television shows and everything that came out of the United States, or any of the performers that came there, it was a big deal, because it was a genuine passion for America and for Americans. So like I said, I spent a year there, and one of the great years of in my life. And again, that's where I first met Barbara.
Yeah, and I know we got some stories there, but we won't go into that. And anyway, I'm going to leave, but I had to come on and just see you, JJ, and say hi to you, and keep in touch.
Well, I look forward to seeing you, and I will say for the whole world to see that, Barbara, I love you.
Thank you. Same here. You take care now, and everybody. It was good to see you all, Dara, Shawn,
Do-
Bob, Bruce. And if I missed anybody, I'm sorry. So good to see you all, and stay safe. And let's have a big reunion when all this is over.
That's
Let's
for
all go
sure.
to Florida.
Florida. Yeah, Darla's
Yeah,
gonna
we'll come hang with you, Barbara.
Take care, everybody. Love you all.
Love you
Bye.
too.
And
What's up, Bruce?
Barbara, thanks very much. I just want to say I'd like to bring Darla on. I think Darla, one of our great wrestling fans, I've seen her every year for years at the Cauliflower Alley Club and other conventions. Great lady. She's been down to Waterloo, Iowa several times. And I know you and JJ are pretty good friends. Got a couple of quick questions for JJ.
Well, I'd just like to say, first of all, when you were talking about his book, it's actually one of my favorite books. And I think my favorite story that JJ tells in there is a story about Rick Martel, but we won't make him go into that. Just read the book. But, you know.
Oh, shit.
Oh, yeah.
JJ, we miss you so much. We're not going to get to see
Now
you.
I got to tell them a little bit about the Rick Martel story.
Okay. I'll let you tell him the story
Okay.
because I love hearing you tell it.
We were wrestling in Florida at the time, and we would go over to Melbourne, which was over on the coast, and you would go across a stretch through the swamps there where there was 2-lane roads and virtually it wouldn't be unusual for you to go 10 miles and not see a car come in the opposite direction. And so on that particular day, we were going to Melbourne. I was driving with Roger Kirby. We were tag champions, and we were riding together. And Terry Funk was driving and had Rick Martel in the car with him. And I'm laughing before I tell the story because so as we're traveling along, like I said, we went through a stretch where we didn't pass any cars coming the other way, and all of a sudden Terry Funk's car started slowing down, getting slower and slower and slower, and I started to try and go around him, and he went to the middle of the road, which is only a 2-lane road, and if you got a car going down the middle, you can't go around him. So I said, well, I don't have no idea what Terry Funk is up to. And finally he comes to a dead stop, and I came to a stop, and there was at least a car length. I was at least a car length between my car and it. Both of us stopped on the highway. No traffic coming either way. All of a sudden, the passenger door opens, and Rick Martel gets out, stark naked. And he starts, and he's dancing as he's walking, and he comes around the back of the car, and he turns around and shimmies his butt at us, and then got around to where the driver's seat was, Terry Funk, and all of a sudden, Terry floors it and takes off. and Rick Martel, it's like he couldn't say anything.
What just happened?
And what just happened? And I'm standing there, and I thought, well, I guess this is Terry's rib on him. So now all of a sudden Rick turns around and realizes that all he can see is the taillights of Terry's car going down the highway. He's buck naked, turns to me, and all of a sudden he's looking at me, and it's like, well, you're my salvation. Don't you go anywhere. It was Kirby and I. So I started easing up, and as I got closer to him, I then went to the left, it was either left or the right, whichever I had a little bit more space on. And as I got alongside of him, I started giving gas to the to the car. And the last thing I remember was Rick Martel's fingers on my rearview mirror, you know, with his bare feet, pat, 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 down the highway as fast as he could. And all of a sudden I saw his hand slip. And as I'm looking in my rearview mirror, I see him flip-flopping down the highway. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I jammed on the brakes. And got out and went back, and he got up, and he was skinned up a little bit, but not that bad. Terry by that time made a U-turn and came back. And what wasn't funny was Rick's, I think his daughter had given him a cat's eye pinky ring. And as he was running, trying to catch up, somehow that ring fell off. And it couldn't have been somewhere within the 100 yards that we ran. And so now we felt bad because we had kind of taken advantage of the situation. And now he had the ring that his sister had just given him. And, so I pulled over. I said, well, it can't be very far. We'll look. It's got to be here somewhere. By that time, Terry came back. And now we didn't start walking 3-4 minutes, and as typical in Florida, along came one of these rainstorms and just buckets of rain, and we're all standing out there soaking wet in the rain looking for Rick Martel's pinky ring. And it took about a half hour, and lo and behold, there it was, sitting on the shoulder on a piece of weed or something and hanging as if somebody had hung it there. So he did get his ring back. And, of course, we were all soaked, got to Melbourne, and it's a wonder we didn't catch pneumonia. That's how bad wet we were.
Let me hit the chat here real quick, gentlemen. Ricky Dona asks, weren't there two different men who played the character Kendo Nagasaki? That is true. There was I believe the British Kendo Nagasaki, and then here on the Pacific coast, Mr. Sakurada in the Pacific Northwest was called Kendo Nagasaki every time he was here. So
yeah, that's true. I never met the Kendo Nagasaki who was legendary in Europe, in Great Britain. And when Terry Funk was in Florida and Sakurada was there, and Terry Funk looked at Sakurada and said, God, because he was a big guy. He was, at least 6 feet tall. And, a lot of the Japanese, weren't as big as some of the Americans physically, but Sakurada was. I mean, he had played sumo, legitimate athlete. And so Terry said, just Kazuo Sakurada, And so one day at the TV station, he sent somebody to the local store that sold martial arts stuff. And he said, get the chest plate and get the stick and get the mask that goes over and bring it back. And they brought it back, and we had Sakurada put on the chest plate, put on the headpiece, and hold the stick, and shot him. And Terry Funk was the one that envisioned that character and actually gave him the name of Kendo Nagasaki.
Huh. Yeah, Bruce has a question.
We had that, the original Kendo Nagasaki, his real name was Peter Thornley. He was from England, and he worked for us for about a year. He was a big top heel in England, and he came over and had the face and all like that. And most of the fans over here thought he might be Oriental. He was actually British, but his name was Peter Thornley. And I think Terry was in maybe as the world champion or something like that. And maybe saw him up here when he was working in the early 70s. And I think Sakurada was in not long after that. He was tagging with another old friend of JJ's named Mr. Heel.
Yes.
And there was sort of some interaction there. Terry sort of knew both of them. And I think Peter Thornley was a good friend of Les Thornton and Billy Robinson, who were kind of cronies of the Funks too. So there's a little bit of kind of history there with the two of them. But yeah, I haven't heard the name Peter Thornley in years. I'm not sure if he's still around or whatever. He was a major draw in England for a long time, and then seems to have dropped out of sight. I haven't heard anything about him for quite a while, though.
And Terry also had kendo, which the Great Muta was the first one to do it, which was to have spray the green mist when he would come to the ring. That was the last thing. He would take all his stuff off, and he would do this gyration and hold his hand up and spew out the green mist.
Well, Ricky Donna has finally answered us. He says, ask JJ about the Jacksonville Landing. That might be the restaurant he was referring to earlier. Nothing? Wrestlers eat at a lot of places.
Yeah. I had Florida was one of my favorite places. You know, I was a big fan of Eddie Graham. Well, when I was a kid, the Graham brothers, Dr. Jerry Graham and Eddie Graham, were huge in the Northeast Territory, huge in the Garden. Sold out the Garden, God knows how many times, and you know, against Rocca and Perez and the other top teams. And Jerry Graham was he was the one with the cigars and very flamboyant, and Eddie was very quiet, and Jerry would do all the talking and Eddie would stand there and never say anything, very stoic. And then once I was in the business, I came to find out that Eddie Graham was one of the most respected people in the business for his knowledge of the business and his understanding of the psychology of the business, which was really the essence of our business. That you can do things mechanically, but if you don't know what to do and when to do it, that's the difference between guys that become legends and superstars in our business and guys that are journeymen. And I so much wanted to get to Florida because Eddie Graham he actually had gotten his knowledge from Dory Funk Sr. and I worked Amarillo. And then when he got to Florida, Eddie was credited with what he did with the career of Jack Briscoe, and then which was basically based on his legitimate credentials, and then the same thing with Dusty Rhodes. Though Dusty was, a lot of people didn't know that he was a very, very qualified wrestler, but it was more the character, the plumber's son, that the people really identified with him. But Eddie was excuse me, Eddie was like he was a psychological genius. And I remember, in Tampa at the Fort Homer Hesley Armory, you had two dressing rooms, but they connected in a back room where you could go from one to the other. And so, with main event matches, they would, talk about the matches. And I can't count the number of times that, and Eddie had a knack of just sitting there, and he would want, if there were four guys in a tag match, he would want the four guys to then sit in the one room and talk about what they were going to do and lay out the story that they were going to try and tell that night. And then when they thought that they had gotten everything that they could put together, Eddie would very quietly be sitting there and not say anything, and he'd be on a folding chair, and he, as the conversation wound down, he would inch his way over, and then without being critical of whatever they came up with, Eddie would, in his very subtle way, would say, did you ever think about this? And he would throw out one little seed, and the eyes would light up, and next thing I know, there's Eddie holding court around these people. And I can't count the number of times that Eddie would then take what was going to be an okay match to be in a super match. And Eddie's finishes would be sometimes, for anybody that worked in Florida that was ever around him, could be 10 minutes long. And and it was like, this happens first, and this is the first stage of planting this seed, and then this, and it would be something that it would build. I mean, I saw so many finishes where the a heel would do something, and then the manager would be there for the heel, and the referee the manager would come up on the apron, the referee would go over there, the referee would grab him and put the manager would put the referee in a bear hug, and then you would hear boom, bang, with these horrible things that the heel did, and then the referee would turn around when the guy's laid out there cold and dive down 1, 2, 3. Well, if you really analyze the situation in a case like that, it would be a hot finish, but a lot of the heat would go on the fact that the referee was in a bear hug held by the manager on the other side of the ring. And Eddie had a knack of taking that scenario and putting little pieces in there where the heel would go do something. Eddie would be distracted for a moment, and then his tension would be back in the ring, and he'd catch somebody that they were about to do something. And what it did was gave the referee credibility that he was genuinely trying to do his job. And then there was one little thing that was the turning point that when that happened and the babyface got screwed and the heel beat him, the referee, the heat didn't all go on the referee because he had demonstrated up to that point by design with how Eddie mapped it all out that he made a genuine effort to try and catch the heel from doing terrible things. And Eddie I learned so much being around him. When I talk about my mentor in the business, it was Eddie Graham. He had a 7th grade education, but he had a doctorate in professional wrestling because he was a genius.
We had some more questions in the chat from fans. GMB222 says, looking good, JJ.
Thank you.
What did you think of Arn and Tully's move to WWF, and did the Midnight know they were on the way during their feud?
You know, it was at a time where the WWF / WWE was kind of where everybody wanted to be. If you draw a parallel to baseball, I mean, you could go and work for the Boston Red Sox, but that was not the same as if you worked for the New York Yankees and appeared in Yankee Stadium. That would be kind of the closest parallel that I could come to. And it just, being around Eddie Graham, and I know for me, I said earlier that I had a kind of a bucket list of my own that I didn't. I thought, well, I won't. In my own mind, I felt I made it in the business unless I went to Australia, because that's where all the stars eventually got a chance to tour. If I went to Japan, because the big stars in the business either went for a Baba or a Inoki. And the third thing was Madison Square Garden. And I never worked the New York territory. So I had never worked Madison Square Garden. And late in my career, Eddie hired me as the booker in Florida, which was a tremendous honor to be under his tutelage. And he guided me and helped me. And in a conversation one day in my office, I talked about how it seemed like just yesterday that as a fan in Trenton, New Jersey, that how many times that I had gone to the Garden in New York City to see Dr. Jerry Graham and Eddie Graham, and thinking to myself, wow, maybe someday I can enter the ring and wrestle in Madison Square Garden. And I said at that point, which was true, I was in the twilight of my career. I was thought of more as a manager. I was wrestling, more on a part-time basis, and Eddie didn't say anything. And so he did. The only comment he made, he said, "So if you'd that would have really meant something to you if you'd wrestled Madison Square Garden." I said, "Yeah, it would have," and didn't think anything of it when he said that. The next day he came in and he said, you got your date book there? And he said, yeah. And I'm looking on the wall here. It was 1984, and it was like April 23rd or whatever it was. He said, take that date, and he said, circle that date, and don't book yourself anywhere, and don't book yourself the day before or the day after. And he said, I called Vince McMahon. It was a time where Vince Jr. had kind of taken over the reins, and tragically, Vince Sr. was a heavy smoker and had contracted lung cancer. And this was about less than 6 months before he died of lung cancer. And Eddie called him and shares that conversation with him. And I to this day get choked up thinking about it. And Eddie and Vince Senior, and Vince Senior used to call me Jimmy, and he said, "Oh, Jimmy was such a wonderful young man," and he said, "I really liked him," and he said he never wrestled in Madison Square Garden. And he said, we need to fix that. and so Eddie comes in the next day, told me to circle that date. And he said, I talked to Vince Sr. and he said, we're going to fly you to New York that day. And he said, put you in a nice hotel in New York. And he said, you will wrestle in Madison Square Garden. And then we'll fly you back. And I didn't know what to say. And that's how it played out. That they flew me to New York, and I wrestled. I was just on the card in Madison Square Garden. The main event, I had the program lineup. Sergeant Slaughter and the Iron Sheik were the main event. It was a 6-man match with Piper and the stars of that era. And I just was on the card. And when I got up there that night, they taped for the Garden Network. And I was just going to have a match, and Tito Santana was there, who had Tito's first match in Texas, and knew Tito had become a big star in the business. And they said, would you wrestle Tito and put him over in the Garden? And I said, I would be humbled and honored to do it. And so I wrestled Tito Santana, my one and only time in Madison Square Garden, which they taped for the Garden Network. And I have the program insert and the copy of that tape.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wrestling Legacies asks, JJ, had you stayed in WCW in the late 80s, who would you had picked to replace Arn and Tully?
Wow.
That's a good question.
Whew.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of great teams. When I first went to work in my first territory really that I worked was in the Carolinas in '81 for Jim Crockett Sr. And it was predominantly a territory built around tag teams. And Rip Hawk and Sweet Hansen were one of the top teams. I lost my train of thought, but I got a chance, like I say, to wrestle in the Garden, which was my dream come true. And like I say, I had 3,200 matches in my career, which a lot of people, if they haven't done the research, in this over a 20-year period of time. And I wrestled in 44 of the states, wrestled for a year, and lived in Australia, which was one of the highlights, and a month in New Zealand going over and back. I spent a couple months in Germany, in Bremen, for the tournaments one year. And I think when I was keeping track of it, I actually wrestled in 44 of the states, and made like 15 tours of Japan with Giant Baba. So I sometimes have to pinch myself to think about, as a 16-year-old fan, and I'm still a fan to this day, from Trenton, New Jersey, that had a fan club for Johnny Valentine and dreamed that maybe someday I could become a wrestler. And I always had when I went to Charlotte full time, Jim Grabmeyer got me booked with Crockett in Charlotte. It was my full-time territory. And I was months from my 28th birthday. I wasn't a kid. And I was treated by Sandy Scott, Johnny Heidemann, and some of the other guys there, because I came there with the idea that I'm in their home, and every day my story was the same about, okay, what are we doing? What do you want me to do tonight? You just tell me. I never suggested anything. And because I was a little bit older and that was my approach, not realizing it, I gained tremendous respect for all those people, because I came there not like somebody who could talk about all the places they'd been and things they'd done and had it all figured out. I was there as a new chapter in my career, and I wanted them to tell me what they wanted me to do, and I would go out there and give my best effort every night.
Were you near or around the infamous flight with Rick and Johnny Valentine that crashed? Or were you on that flight or
no? The flight, the flight that the tragedy that I was around was the one where it was Rick McCord, Buddy Colt. I think it was his plane, and somebody drowned. I'm trying to think of who it was that they landed and the plane crashed. When the plane came in, they had real low level clouds, and I was in a private plane with Bob Roop. We had rented a plane with a pilot because we used to do TV on Wednesdays and then in Florida, and then it was a long trip, 265 miles to Miami, which was our main town, and we would always do well there, and so we would always get together and charter a flight to go after interviews down to Florida, and which would enable them most times to get a home that night. And I remember
was Gary Hart, Bobby Shane, and Austin Idol.
Yep. And Bob Roop and I were in a plane, and we had a private pilot, and it was just the two of us, and Murdoch had some beer, a couple cases of beer in the back, and I remember looking out the window, and Buddy Colt had only had about 100 hours of flying experience and bought the plane. And I remember the call numbers were 456 BC for Buddy Colt. And they taxied just a little bit around. We're going to take off ahead of us. And I remember looking out the window, and I remember seeing, Gary Hart's face and Bobby Shane in the window and waving hi in the window before they took off. And they took off ahead of us, and about halfway there, we hit, which happened often, that storms would come in off the Gulf, and they would come through Tampa, and they would be pretty intense for a period of time while they were there, but it was like a daily occurrence. And when we took off, weather was fine, and I remember hearing the pilot talking to Tampa, and they said, when you land, check on 456 BC. We heard that they were having some trouble, and then didn't think anything of it other than 456 BC. That's Buddy's plane. And a minute or two later, I could hear the radio transmission. They said, "Forget 456 BC. We understand that they crashed into the bay." When you talk about a deathly silence in that plane, and when we came in, it was just teeming rain, and then all of a sudden, as we came down, it was like it was terrible rain, but there was a cloud about just not even 100 yards, and then when you broke through that cloud, it was as clear as in this room, and there was the runway in front of us. Our pilot was like a commercial pilot. He landed, and there were some fans that heard on the CB radio that some wrestlers had come down and crashed into the bay, and they came over there thinking that they had crashed at the airport where we landed, which was Peter O'Knight Airport out on that little the Tampa main airport was closed at that point, and we were able to get in Peter O'Knight, which was a small airport because of a small plane, and our cars and everything were over at the Tampa airport. And there were some fans that came by, and they said, "Oh, we heard some wrestlers crash. Come on, we'll take you over to your car." And and it was like a peninsula. And when we went around the other side, there's an ambulance parked there with the lights flashing. And so we stopped to get out and see what was going on. And they said the plane had crashed just inside the inlet. And there was a home there. There was a row of homes, but a doctor had a home, and it was right behind this doctor's home. As we walked over there, back there to see, there's Buddy Colt laying on the lawn, and Murdoch and I were there, and Buddy was his ankle was off at a very, very ugly angle that was enough to upset you just to look at that. And an ambulance was there, and because of Buddy's size, they didn't know how they were going to get him from the ground onto this litter to get him into the ambulance. So Murdoch got on one side, I got on the other, and we wiggled our hands underneath Buddy and were able to pick him up far enough that they were able to slide a thing under him to get him on, to lift him up, to take him in the ambulance. And then they said that, and there was a helicopter circling out there. And by that time it was more like a light drizzle, and they were circling. They said that Gary Hart had gone to the hospital already and had a pretty good size wound over his eye. We had gotten Buddy Colt onto a thing, and they said that Bobby Shane, they hadn't been able to find Bobby Shane, and this helicopter was searching and looking. And we had TV the next morning, and went to TV, and they said that a couple hours later they found the wreckage in the bottom of the bay, and that Bobby Shane was still in. It looked like they said somebody had taken the plane was broken to all kinds of pieces, but the main part of the fuselage was pretty well intact. And it said it looked like somebody with incredible strength had just smashed the control panel and gone in there and taken all the wires and just pulled them out. And that Bobby Shane, and this was, the diver was had gone down underwater. And he said Bobby was still strapped into his seat. And he said he took a knife and cut the seatbelt and took Bobby by his, the belt, and just floated him out up to the top. And he had apparently, hit his head on contact and knocked him out. And so it didn't appear, he said, I've been to things like this. And he said, if somebody is caught in a situation like that, can't get the seatbelt undone or whatever, and they're drowning, their hands would be like fighting to get that seatbelt torn loose. And he said, until they pass out. And he said, Bobby was just, and he said, cut him loose. And he said, just floated him out. And he said it was obvious that he was knocked unconscious on impact and didn't suffer.
Bruce?
Hi, Bob. Hi, JJ. Great show. Thank you so much, sir. I've got a couple of questions from two of our longtime listeners. First guy, Bobby Valente, Queens, New York. And he said, if you can ask JJ in his tenure with the WCW, what would you consider the best part of that and the worst part of that? Bobby Valente. And I have another question right after that.
Okay, Bobby, I worked for WCW. I worked for Vince McMahon, and my philosophy, even back in the old territory days, was wherever I went, my mind was totally focused on the person that I'm working for, that's signing my check, that they had all of my energy. I didn't get involved in political squabbles, or I may have worked at another time for one of their arch competitors, and I never talked bad about anybody else. So I never had to all of a sudden eat crow because, well, now you're working for the other side, and they remember that you said this when you were over there, now, or vice versa. So I just learned early on to give my best effort for whoever was paying me at that time. And if you do that, that's all I think anybody can ask of you, is give loyalty to who you're working with, which doesn't mean that you have to speak badly about what is perceived as their competition, even if you at some time before had worked for their competition. And that was always my philosophy. If I don't have something good to say about you or anybody else, I don't have any comment. And that way I never had somebody come to me and say, well, you said this about so-and-so. Did you ever regret that? And I never was confronted with anything like that because in my own mind, I don't think I ever talked bad about anybody that I ever worked with or had worked with.
And I've got another question here from Oklahoma City, a guy named Carmine. He said, can you ask JJ Dillon, ask him how he thinks Bruiser Brody would have got over in the WWE had he gone to the WWE?
Bruiser Brody was a unique talent. I was around Frank. I actually wrestled against Frank a few times in Texas, and he was very very physical. Somebody can be physical without hurting you. By that I mean you can. I don't care how hard you hit me in the chest with a forearm smash or across my back, as long as you don't hit me in the mouth and knock teeth out, that kind of thing. That's what I'm referring to. And Bruiser Brody was one of those guys that was physical, that when you're in there, you knew you were gonna, it was gonna be an exercise, and that you were gonna have to work hard, and you might be, sore that night and probably still the next day, but also you would know that you were going to have a match with him where everybody would say, oh, wow, because that's the kind of performer he was, and that he would bring the best out of you. And he was the kind of guy that if he hit you, you had to hit him as hard for self-preservation. And so I have nothing but great memories about Frank Goodish, and Frank would have been a big, big star for the WWE or anywhere and everywhere that he ever would have worked, because he was that good a talent.
Michael Allen Rubin asks, JJ, the matches between Joe LeDuc and Barry Windham were so good and they looked stiff. Were they as hard hitting as they really looked?
Similar thing. I broke Barry Windham in. He had his first professional match with me. He so badly wanted to break in as a wrestler. And of course, his father was Blackjack Mulligan. And for whatever the reason, because, it could be a tough business, that he, at every opportunity that he could, discouraged Barry from, ever wanting, from ever being able to wrestle as long as Jack was there and had any say in the matter. Now, Barry he was the one that hauled the ring and would then referee. And we were somewhere and I had always told Barry, so, well, how your father feels, and I wouldn't want him getting mad at me, but I said, I learned a lesson very early on that every day, make sure in the trunk of your car, you always have your gear, because you never know. And we were somewhere one night where, I don't know if it was because of weather or whatever, we got to the arena and it was time for the matches to start. And Barry was there, who was actually one of the referees. I was there, and there was no one else. So they postponed the start of the show for like 15 minutes, but it was like they couldn't do it indefinitely. And I said, Barry, you got your gear? Yeah, go get it. And Barry went, put his gear on, and he didn't have a chance. If he knew ahead of time that he was booked and was going to wrestle for the first time, he probably would have been a nervous wreck, but he didn't have a chance to to go through all that advance angst, because it was like something that was just not planned in advance. And he went and got his gear, and I said, just listen to me and hang with me. And I said, we may need to get a little time till we know that somebody else is here for the next match. And I don't know. I mean, if it was 20 minutes or more, I would say, yeah, that's probably true. And it's funny, even though he never had any formal training, it was like me. I was never formally trained to wrestle. I learned to wrestle by being the third man in the ring and listening to what the guys did, watching what they did, watching the timing of everything, watching what they did and how the fans reacted to it. And I was never trained by anyone, but that's how I learned to wrestle, was from having been a referee. The same thing with Barry. I said, I'll guide you through it. We'll just do basic stuff, nothing crazy. And God, 30 seconds to less than a minute into the match, you can sense when somebody just has natural raw talent, because he certainly had the size. He had the good looks. The girls were crazy around him. And so he had his first match with me. We put in some time. And I said, your father can't be mad because of the circumstances that we had to go on with the show. And if he's mad at anybody, tell him to call me and be mad at me. Don't be mad at you. And that was how his career started. Ted DiBiase, the same thing, had his first match with me.
You got another question there, Bobby?
Yeah, I've got another question here from Len in Edmond, who said he met you down at the Cauliflower Alley Club. Len asks if you can ask JJ, what are his highs and lows of his WWE career in the 90s, and whether or not he did any managing when he was at the WWE in the 90s.
I never wrestled as a talent for the WWE, and when I was hired there, I was approached by Terry Garvin, and I was, I had done everything that I could possibly want to accomplish, and Vince, the business had grown such, and he needed help, and Terry Garvin came to me, and he said, and he had already left WCW and went to work running towns for Vince McMahon for the WWE. And I ran into Terry Garvin. We were friends, and he said, your name has been mentioned a bunch of times up there. And I said, well, and he said, they are very, very interested in you, but because I was working for WCW, politically, they couldn't call me direct, but I could at least call them. And so Terry Garvin and Pat Patterson worked for Vince by then, and Terry and Pat Patterson were very close. So I said, well, I'm willing to talk to him. And so he said, well, give Pat a call. So I called and talked to Pat, and they said, well, look, and we had a show up in New Jersey, and I said, I can say, it was right around the holiday, around the Christmas holidays, and I was going to have time off. And I said, I could stay up there. And they said, well, Vince would like to meet with you, understands your circumstances, and he just would like to have a conversation with you to wherever that conversation may go. And he said he doesn't want to have you come to the office where people are going to know you're there and the word will get out that you were in Vince's office to meet with him. So he said he would like to meet with you privately in his home in Greenwich. And I said, oh, wow, that's really nice. And he said, they'll send a car in for you and take you to the house, and you'll meet privately with Vince. And so that's what happened. Car came and got me, and I went to Vince's house, and Vince came in. He had been doing promos at the studio and came in about 20 minutes late, apologized for keeping me waiting, and still had his makeup on. And we met in his house, sitting at the dining room table. And he told me that he was very interested in me, and he made it clear right from the beginning. He said, I heard so many good things about you for your attention to detail. And he said, that's something that I sorely need here in my company. Your attention to detail, that they said, you've been everywhere, done everything in the business. And he said, I would be hiring you for your mind to look at what's going on here and to see. He said, I'm not even sure what the role where it could help, but he said, I just know that you could help us as we grow. And I was making pretty fair money and with WCW, and I had a contract and it ran out, and they never renewed or put me under another contract. So I basically was working without a contract. And I said, the only thing is, and he said, we don't want you as a manager. We strictly want you as office personnel with doing a whole bunch of things. And I said, well, that's good. I said, I guess I'm spoiled because I've done well financially, and I would hate to take a step backwards financially, but understanding that there's certain limits to where you could go, because that's not what you want me for. And it ended up that he basically offered me a salary that was comparable to what I was making that time. And I would become an employee and have all the benefits and everything. So that's how it worked out.
Now, Bruce Hart told me that you're a hell of a booker. And maybe you could, anyway, if Bruce Hart said it, it's got to be true, because he's a hell of a booker. So what are some of the important things that you see are kind of lost on today's generation that you think should be brought back?
Oh, Bruce could probably answer that better than me. The one thing about the business, and it was that way from before I broke into the 20 some years that I was 20, 30 years that I was active in the business to even now, the business is ever changing, and you have to be flexible to realize the changes and to be able to adjust and adapt to the changes if you're going to. And the other thing about the business too is it's a 24/7 job. And that was one of the things that impressed me about Vince McMahon. That Vince McMahon never asked you to do anything that he didn't do. Vince McMahon is a workaholic. I don't know that I could ever have worked as hard as he does and still does to this day. And Vince would be in the office all week handling every aspect of the business. Posters for pay-per-view, he personally approved of whatever that poster was going to be. And a lot of times they would take a crowd shot behind the ring, and if you've ever sat at ringside and somebody had seating behind it, it's never 100% full. Somebody's either gone to the concession stand, gone to the bathroom or whatever, and Vince would say, okay, I want that in there. And he said, I want those seats. I don't want an empty seat in there. I want it filled in. His attention to detail was something that I've learned from everybody that I've ever been around in the business. And I always regarded Eddie Graham as the professor that I learned the most from. But I also learned a tremendous amount from Vince McMahon. And he's been a success at everything that he has ever done. And he's the one person who there were other promoters that branched out across the country, but Vince was the first one that had a vision of doing it on a global basis. And he did it, and he was the first, and he's been incredibly successful. And so I've, when you work for Vince, I'd be in the office all week, and with Pat too. Pat was of the same mindset. And all of the creative stuff that we did was not done in the office during the week. It was done on Saturday and then usually Sunday at Vince's house. And we would either sit out he had a pool with a veranda with a bank of phones. And if the weather was bad or they got a shower, it was covered over. And that's where we would work. And we had these great big ledgers because they were booking 3 towns a night. and I learned how to have a roster of who all the baby faces were, who the heels were, and depending on the importance of the town, between Vince, with Vince's blessing, and Pat, we would then have a record of the last time they ran, who was on the card, so as not to repeat that. I mean, I learned so much from all the details of booking with Vince McMahon, and we would write down the main event, and we would get Vince to give his blessing or whatever, to if Pat and I came up with suggestions to put him down, and Vince would approve. And if it was a big town, we'd have down to like the third match. If it was a secondary town, it would be at least 2 matches. Wow. And if it was a spot show somewhere, as long as you had a main event that was going to draw.
That's incredibly thorough.
Yep. He was Vince ran it like a business. And again, I said, I sound like a broken record. They never stopped learning in this business. And I had all those years in the business, and my learning curve continued for my time with Vince McMahon. And the reason he's successful is because he doesn't expect anything from you that he doesn't do himself.
And JJ, one of the regular features that we've had on Hart Beat Radio and our new the Hart Beat on YouTube, we have, these are coming from our fans all over the planet, and I'm going to name some guys, and if you can tell me in one word or just one word or one sentence.
Short answer.
A short answer, if you don't mind. And I'll start
You're
with.
Asking a lot of me to get a short answer about anything. If you ask me about how hot it is outside, I'm not going to tell you. Well, it's kind of hot. It's mild. It's warm. You'll find out what the temperature is. And,
loud and clear.
Go ahead.
Okay, the first Dory Funk and Terry Funk.
Don't get any better than the two of them. How many brother combinations do you know in the business that were both NWA World Heavyweight Champions and champions with different styles, with different? I mean, Dory was a champion for a 7-year period of time. Terry was a champion for a couple different times, and his style was very different. When you wrestled Dory Funk, it was kind of like wrestling Pat O'Connor, just somebody that was so smooth and so just smooth, and had such an understanding of the psychology and the pacing. And yet you wrestled Terry Funk, and it's like sometimes you thought you were in a battle for your life. I remember I started in Amarillo, and I started I made TV on Thursday, and of course they didn't even see me because that TV didn't air until Saturday. And that Saturday was a little town that they would run sometimes outside of Amarillo called Hereford Bull Barn. It was a town that a lot of Mexican farm workers, and it wasn't a major town. So my first week in the territory, I did TV, and then I was booked in the Hereford Bull Barn on Saturday, then Albuquerque, which was their major town, on Sunday, and then the rest of the circuit was El Paso Monday, Odessa, and on around the loop to Joe's towns down around San Antonio. So I worked the TV. Now, again, they haven't seen me yet, and I'm on Saturday. I go to Hereford. That's actually my first official date, and I'm booked in the main event against Terry Funk. So Ken Farber was the referee then, and you didn't dress in the same dressing rooms. Ken Farber comes over and he said, "You're in the main event tonight with Terry Funk, and we want 45 minutes through." And I looked at him and I thought, they haven't even seen me yet, and I'm in the main event in this town that's, not a big town, and I'm with Terry Funk, and they want 45 minutes time limit match. And I said, well, why doesn't Terry I'll put Terry over. It's not a problem. I'm a new guy here. Nope. Terry wants 45 minutes. So I'll do whatever he wants. And we went out, and it was an education. And with Terry, like I say, sometimes because Dory was very smooth. Terry was very physical. Now, when I say physical, he didn't, you were going to get your teeth knocked out. But when he hit you, with a forearm or something across the back or something, or a boot. And he was physical without hurting you. And I was okay with that. And he would hit me with a forward arm. And if you didn't hit him back as hard, he would hit you twice as hard. Okay, I got the message. He wants me to hit him with the same intensity as he's hitting me. That's the style of match that Terry wanted. Now,
all right, that was the short answer, I think.
Yeah.
Guy Archie, the Stomper Goldie.
Oh. Archie was the first guy that I managed. And I wrestled Archie I was an underneath talent for 2 years for Jim Crockett Promotions in Charlotte. That's where I broke in. And Leo Burke and them used to come down from the Maritimes, and because they ran up in Canada in the arenas that had hockey, and in the wintertime when the ice was down, they had no wrestling. When the ice was up in the summer, that's when they were a 5-month territory at the hockey arenas in the summer. And so they were, I don't remember who it was every year they would have a featured heel wrestler, and it was Killer Carl Crope one year. It was it was Archie Goldie for 1 year, and then can't think of his name. Blonde guy who lived there was a tag team wrestler, and Freddie Sweetan. And every year they would give Freddie Sweetan a fresh partner, and you would be his partner for the season. You would win the tag belts, and at the end of the season, before you left, you'd drop them back. And that formula just went on forever with them. So I was booked to be there for the whole season as Freddie Sweetan's partner. And I forget who was going to be the main event. 2 weeks before the season opened, whoever was going to be their feature heel for that season got a call from Vince McMahon to give him a starting date for a run in New York. Well, the Cormiers were understood the business, that they thought here was the guy that they were all set for their season, and the guy that was going to be their top heel now is all of a sudden not going to be there. And what are they going to do? And I remember riding with Leo Burke, because he would come down to the Carolinas for the summer. And so I said, I'm already coming up for the season to team with Freddie Sweetan. And I said, you've had this parade of all these monster heels, from Krupp to the Stomper, going on back, Eric Pomeroy, and all these monster guys. So what if you changed the formula 1 year and had a guy who was a loudmouth, braggadocious heel, who wasn't an overpowering heel, who was a wrestling heel, that would go out there and wrestle, and then the minute that you started getting the best of him, that's when he would take shortcuts, pull hair, do things, take a gimmick, and knock somebody out. And I said, but to hear him talk, you would think that person thought they were the greatest person in the world. So I said, if you don't have anybody, I said, I'd like to take a shot at that. I think I maybe surprise you. So we go to the town the next day, and Leo Burke says, well, I called Rudy, and Rudy said, oh, yeah, okay, that's interesting. And that's all he said. I said, okay, well, I just threw that out. Just a crazy idea. I'm coming for the season anyway as Freddie's tag partner. The next day I make a ride with Leo, and he said, Rudy called me back, and he said the more he thought about it, the more intriguing the idea was to change the formula up here and not go with a monster heel, but to go with somebody who wrestles, cheats when it gets bad, and runs his mouth. And he said the only thing, and at that point I was maybe 228, 230 max maybe. And he said, Rudy just said he's going to give you a shot at it. But he said, drink a 6-pack of beer every night and see if you can't put on another 10 or 15 pounds. Well, I was tall, I looked bigger in the ring than.
How tall were you in your prime, JJ? You are a pretty lanky guy.
Yeah, I was a little. You shrink as you get older. I think I was 6'1". So in the ring, because I was tall, I looked bigger than what, if I got on the scale, what I actually was. So they, as happens in this crazy business, a lot of opportunities are come about as a result of being in the right place at the right time. And I'm living proof of that. And they didn't have another option, because all the other so-called top guys were on top in other territories, and they weren't going to steal them away from somewhere else. And so they didn't have a choice but to say, okay. They just said, drink some beer if you can't put on 10 pounds. And they got Lord Al Hayes then took my spot as Freddie's tag team partner for that season, which was a nice opportunity for Alfred Hayes, who was a good talker and a good hand as well. And I will say this, I bought some flamboyant clothes, and they got me over. And in other words, you only got one shot at it, and you're either going to do it or not. And so the first night I was in the main event against the Beast, who was the champion, and they wanted me to they gave me a bicycle chain that came out like for snow tires. You would have chains, and they had one of the links that would go across for snow chains, and I tied the two together and could put it in my trunks, and it had these studs. And so I wrestled the Beast the first night. He was the champion in Halifax, and he got the best of me. I went in, got the tights, hit him, but I didn't want to hurt him, and he staggered back, and he pulled me into the corner. I said, hit me, God damn it. So I thought, okay, wham, I whacked him. Well, I laid his eye open, and blood pouring everywhere. Got back to the dressing room. I'm sick now. And the referee comes over, and I said, please tell Ivan I am sick. I'm so sorry. He said, he's over there proud. He's got to go to the hospital and get stitches. I said, oh, no. Yes. And he said, and he's proud of it. And he said, because you did what he asked you to do. And that got me over. They thought I was a badass. And
that's awesome, man.
They ended up having their best season ever, because the formula changed from all these big heels to a guy who wasn't a monster, who talked like he was the greatest thing on earth. And I got all my heat for my interviews and the fact that I was a wrestling heel. And when things got bad, and so with the Beast, I knocked him out, and then they changed the formula, because now I'm having my best matches with Leo Burke, because we would go out there. I mean, we went a bunch of hour Broadways, which you couldn't do, with the Beast. And it ended up, I'd been making at that point, this is back in the 70s in Charlotte, or early 80s. And I'd been making, I think my first year in the Carolinas, I made $260 a week average. And that you only work 6 days. But that was still a lot of money compared to what the average working man was back in the 70s. And I went up to Canada as a main eventer, and I think for 23 or 24 weeks, I ended up making $25,000. I had never seen that kind of money before. And it cemented my reputation. And I had wrestled, Dory was the world champion. I had wrestled him in the Carolinas. And he told me, he said, well, when you finish here, he said, I know that you're slated to go up there, but he said, it's a 6-month territory. And he said, when you're done, he said, I don't want you to make any phone calls. He says, you're coming to Amarillo. And he said, we'll have a main event spot for you. And he said, I'll guarantee you that you'll get to go to Japan, which was one of my dreams, for at least 2 tours. So I already knew I had a place to go, and went from there to Amarillo and had a phenomenal run in Amarillo. And that established my status in the business. And then I went from there to work for Eddie Graham in Florida and never looked back.
What are some of your fondest memories of working with Rick Rude?
I don't remember a whole lot about Rick Rude, other than Rick Rude was a good-looking guy and a good performer. I don't think I wrestled him that much, but he was one of the top guys in the business. Ravishing Rick Rude.
Yeah, somebody asked. I thought you had managed him for a minute.
I may have earlier.
And,
I can't remember. I dropped in my head a few too many times. I can't remember what I had for breakfast.
And JJ, on the we have a few more people on this list. In a sentence or two, if you could tell us about Vern Gagne.
I never worked Minneapolis territory. I'm trying to think of where I went to Dallas. Had a great run in Dallas, which was the beginning of my managerial career. I was originally going to go I think I was going to go there to wrestle, and Archie Goldie was a top name in the business. And I had wrestled Archie in the Maritimes because he'd been a big name up there. And then when I went to Florida, I wrestled Archie in Florida, and I was, semi-attraction team with Roger Kirby, and we were tag champions. So Stomper left and was going to Tennessee with Bearcat Wright as his manager. Well, that lasted about 3 weeks, and no knock against Bearcat Wright, but knowing the personality of Archie and Bearcat, I could see that them being together every night, traveling together, would be a strain on all parties involved. And so Archie said, Bearcat got mad and left, and he said, so I didn't have a manager. I had to do some of my own promos, and he said, it killed my gimmick. I've got to leave Tennessee. And he said, I've called, and he said, I have a spot in Dallas, or I have a spot in Minneapolis with Vern. And I said, well, and he said, the one in Dallas, he said, Red Bastien is the booker with Fritz. And he said, that's where I would like to go. And he said, I need a manager. Have you ever managed? I said, no. And I said, I have to go get some clothes and whatever. So that was the beginning of my managerial career, and just got along real good with Archie and Archie was his own worst enemy. He was very moody, and which I was okay with that. I mean, I could ride in the car, and if the guy that's sitting there on a 150-mile trip doesn't want to talk, I'm okay. I don't have to. It's not like I'm nervous because he's not talking to me. I live in my own world too. So Archie leaves and goes to. He's leaving to go. Where was I going? So I ended up going to Dallas. So Archie's there for about 2-3 weeks. Everything is going really good. They've got big plans for us. Fritz was, of course, the owner, and Red Bastien was the booker. And Archie, he would say, they don't have any plans for us here. And if you could be sky high emotionally and a 20-minute ride in the car with Archie, and he'd have you looking for a razor blade or something to slit your wrists with. he would emotionally drag you down. So Archie leaves. Archie's fail safe when everything else wasn't working out. He could call Stu Hart, and Stu would welcome Archie back with no advance notice. Archie, just leave, your book starting tomorrow. And Archie would just pack up and go. And that's what happened in Dallas. And Red calls me and he said, I tried calling Archie and he said, nobody answers. I said, oh, that's strange. I said, I'll go by his house and see if he's okay. So Archie had rented a house. I go by the house. I go around to all the windows. I look in the windows. The house is bare. It's empty. I call Red and I said, Red, the house is empty. He's not there. I don't know where he is. I certainly haven't talked to him. And then by that time, he found out that he had called Stu and was already back in Calgary. And they had invested already, 6-8 weeks with the two of us. And he said, well, you've got some heat on you. And he said, I was able to get Lonnie Main, who is finishing up in San Francisco. And he said, we'll bring Lonnie in, you managing him, and we'll take advantage of what we got invested in you, and you manage Lonnie Main. So that's fine with me. That's what they did. Lonnie came in and had an incredible run. And Lonnie was, God, he was beautiful to be around. And ended up, I stayed there for 2 years and managed different guys.
Good. And JJ, if you can tell us a sentence or two about George Scott.
I didn't have much contact with George Scott. George got the Carolinas off and running and had a phenomenal run in the Carolinas. He was the talk of the whole wrestling business. And it just was one of those things that I started in the Carolinas. I was always lucky that wherever I went to, I would be able to stay for anywhere close to a year, which was guys that had to go and move every 4 months or 6 months was a hardship because a lot of times they couldn't rent an apartment because they couldn't get something with that short a lease, and they were in a hotel. Their expenses were higher. And I always was able to go, and everywhere that I went, stay for like a minimum of a year. And where my train of thought was. So I went to Dallas, managed Lonnie Main, and ended up and managed some other guys too, and stayed there for like 2 years. Then Archie called me again, and he said, boy, he's apologizing. He said, I made such a big mistake. He said, we were such a great combination and had such a good thing going. And he said, it's all my fault. It's not yours. And he said, you may not want to even take a chance with me because of that. But anyway, he said, I've got 2 places where I'm figured in with a top spot, don't have a manager, and was hoping that you'd be willing to manage me. And he said, we can go to Minneapolis for Vern, or we can go to Atlanta for Jim Barnett. So you pick, doesn't matter to me. I'd be happy then knowing we have a top spot either place. So it ended up he ended up because I think he knew Barnett a little bit from other places, and so that's where he said, well, we got a spot in Barnett, and this is the starting date. And later on, I was somewhere, and I was in California, and Vern came in for the week, and I rode with him, and he let me know that at one point I was supposed to come to work for him, and didn't go to work for him, went to work for Atlanta, and he didn't say that he felt insulted or demeaned because I would rather go to work for Barnett in Atlanta than work for him in Minneapolis. And I said, no, it wasn't. I said, that's where Archie wanted to go. And it didn't, it wasn't any big deal. I never had to look for a place to go, and just my things all fell in place with my career.
Yeah, Bob.
More here, a few more, but Ric Flair, and a sentence or two about Ric Flair.
No, I got a really important question about Ric Flair, actually, if you don't mind.
Go.
JJ, this is a very important question. People have been wondering this for a long time. At the height of the Four Horsemen, when Space Mountain was open 18 hours a day, on average in a year, how many penicillin shots did the Four Horsemen have to get?
I was very, very careful. And but the only thing is, during that period of time, as I look back on it, I don't know when I slept. It was like with Flair, you'd go to a small town and he would go out there and go 25, 30 minutes because that's the only way that he knew to go. And which is why I think he's one of the greatest champions ever, because the work ethic that he instilled in himself. Mm-hmm. And I so thoroughly enjoyed being around Rick. I consider him a great friend, working with Rick, and did very well for all the times that I was ever with him.
And we have, how about in a sentence or two, Harley Race, JJ? Great.
Harley, the most that I was ever around him was when I went to Florida. Bobby Shane was to be the booker. And I was finishing up in Dallas, went to Florida, and I started off managing big guy, wore a mask. Terrible with names. I'll think of his name in a minute, but wanted to manage him. And Harley was there. And it was the first time that I was really around Harley. And Harley just, if you drove with him, he would drive 100 miles an hour, and you would just take that seatbelt and pull it as tight as it could, for fear that if we have a wreck, I hope I survive. Because he just was, and if he would get pulled over by the cops for going 100 miles an hour, they'd get a ticket. The cop would pull away. He's going 100 miles an hour, and then he'd get another ticket. And Harley he was the one person in all my career that I met that I think had no fear of anything. Harley had nothing scared Harley. And he got stopped one time supposedly by a cop, and he got out of the car, and the cop got out of the car and saw it was Harley Race, and had a sawed-off shotgun in the middle of his thing. He got out, took the shotgun with him, and basically said to Harley, "I know who you are." And Harley said, "I don't appreciate you pointing the gun with me." And he backed the cop down around the car to the edge of the road, and there was an embankment, and the cop fell backwards and rolled backwards down the hill with that shotgun. They could have shot Harley, but Harley had no fear of anything. I don't know how many boat wrecks he had. He had more plates in his head that anytime we would go through anything at the airport, he'd set off more alarms just because of all the metal that was in his head. But what a wonderful guy he was. He just, I got to work Kansas City territory for a year, and Harley was still champion at that point, and he would just come in and out. And I was around Bob Geigel, and that time in Kansas City, I didn't get rich, but it was such a positive learning experience. And anytime I've ever been around Harley, he just one of the all-time great champions.
Phil de Cesare asks JJ's thoughts on Gorilla Monsoon.
Gorilla was when I was I started as a referee in New York. That's where I was from originally. And Gorilla came in, and Monsoon, he was Italian, Robert J. Morella, Gorilla Monsoon. And he basically was kind of, which at that time, now they call it a booker, but he would run towns, and he just again was one of those guys that took good care of me and showed me great kindness. And I can't say anything but good about Gorilla Monsoon.
And Michael,
and And what about Jim Barnett?
Oh, my boy. Jim was, again, he was, when you look at Jim Barnett was, I'm trying to think of the right word. The word that I come to that I hope is not insulting is he was prissy. And Jim would come in, and Ole was the booker, and Jim owned the territory. And Jim we'd have a meeting with the boys, and Jim would come in, and he would sit on the edge of the table and cross his legs, and he'd be swinging his one leg, and Ole would say things that just, and finally Jim would have to just get up and leave. But I made money with Jim. He was because of his kindness when we were in Dallas. I remember one time I was living with my wife before we got my second wife, I think, before we got married, or was it our last wife? Second wife. Anyway, and Jim had been very, very kind to me. And so I said to Jim one night, and my wife, Lindsay, had at that time had met Jim too. And she was somebody that just would, she'd been an airline hostess and successful in business, and she could relate immediately to Jim Barnett, and he just loved her. So she said one day, why don't you go? She invited Jim over to have dinner with us, and Jim, nobody ever invited Jim Barnett to come to their house to have dinner. So he lived in Dallas in a hotel, and I'll go pick him up, and got a nice bottle of wine, and Lindsay cooked a really, really nice dinner. And it meant so much to Jim just because a lot of people made fun of him, and not a lot of people showed him maybe the respect that he should have gotten. They never did anything in front of him because he was a powerful figure in our business. And it just meant so much to him that somebody would want to invite Jim in their home for a home-cooked meal.
We got a question from a fan in the chat. Michael Allen Rubin asks about Bruno, Big John Studd, and Ricky Steamboat.
Ooh. Bruno was one of my dearest friends in the business. I started refereeing my second year of college. Went to Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I got a job. I had a job, but I was a referee for the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission and later New Jersey Athletic Commission. And who was it you were asking about?
They asked about Bruno.
Oh, Bruno. Okay. And so my second year, and right when I started refereeing, Bruno became the champion. And in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, they had all the referees were commission assigned, most, if not all of which, were not wrestling fans. It was a chance for them as a political plum. Oh, I'll get you on, and you'll be a referee, and you just go and be able to count three, and you pay you $100, which was a lot of money at that time. Well, when you're running towns where you're having to do returns, you have to do some controversial things, and sometimes some things that involved heat with the referee. And all the referees were thrilled to pick up that $100 at the end of the night. But the minute that there was a finish of a talk where they were going to do something controversial that in some cases put some heat on the referee so as to get a return out of it, the referees, oh, my knee, my back. And the wrestlers knew that that I certainly didn't care. Whatever they wanted to do, I was there. And so the guys really had a lot of respect for me because I was the one guy for matches that they were trying to do something controversial. They wanted me to referee because I wasn't worried about the heat. And up in Philadelphia with a lot of big following of Puerto Rican wrestlers, or fans especially. And a lot of times if you had something with heat, getting back to the dressing room from the ring was was an adventure. And the guys used to tell me we would do something controversial that would be a hot finish, and they knew that it was going to be hot. And the guys liked me because I helped them make money in the business by being a part of controversial finishes when none of the other referees would do it. And so they took care of me. Vince, at the end of the night, when they paid everybody, I would get paid for the referee, and then they'd come slip me extra money because I was good for the business to do what they needed to be done business-wise. And I had a good run as a referee, and made a lot of friends in the business during that period of time. But Bruno became champion. We developed a friendship because a lot of those controversial matches involved guys that he programmed with of getting return matches. When Baron Cicluna came in, or Jesse Ortega, or any of those guys, it was hard enough to build. They would beat Victor Rivera to get the heat, or Antonio Parisi, Tony Puglisi, who was like supposedly Bruno's cousin. They would beat him up and squash him to get them hot. Well, now wait till Bruno gets a hold of you. That kind of logic. And then hopefully, depending on how well the houses did, they would have 2 and 3 week programs. And in the case of Kowalski, they wanted to get a 4 week deal out of it because Walter was such a huge draw. And I would do whatever needed to be done, controversial wise, with a finish, even if it meant a little heat going on the referee when the other referees didn't want any part of it. So when they would run big shows like Boston and like in Washington, and they were going to do something with Bruno and let's say Kowalski, the Skolin would call me and say, we're doing something special, and we appreciate it if you'd work, be a referee. And then they took good care of me money-wise too. And I developed quite a personal friendship with Bruno as a result of that. And he always looked after me, and we became friends after. And in fact, when Bruno passed away, I'm not one for viewings and funerals. I prefer in death to remember people as I knew them when they were alive. And in Bruno's case, I just knew that I would not have been able to live with myself if I hadn't gone to Pittsburgh to go to the viewing and to go to the service. And it's one of the few times I went, and I remember seeing Bruno at the viewing. God, what a powerful man he was, and he was loved by everybody.
Let me ask you another question here, JJ. Michael Allen Rubin is curious to know if you have any knowledge of the Big John Studd Andre backstage heat that Rocky Johnson mentioned in his book.
Not really. I didn't run into backstage politics or whatever. Studd was a big guy. He was not as big as Andre, but he was the closest to being a giant. And I was around him a lot too, and went to his service when he passed away, and I regarded him as a friend as well.
And then Big Roy 38 asks if you have any memories of Gordon Soley.
Gordon Soley was the greatest television announcer for wrestling ever. That covers a lot of territory. There have been great announcers, and no disrespect to Jim Ross, but when I went to Florida, and then when he went to Gordon went to Georgia and started doing Georgia wrestling with Roddy Piper, Gordon called wrestling matches kind of like Jim McKay would have on Wide World of Sports if he was calling a wrestling match. He knew the names of holds, and he knew when to flavor it with more of the wrestling side of things. But to me, Gordon was the best announcer that I was ever around.
Bob Johnson, I know you got a couple more questions.
Okay, yeah. Hi, I've got a couple more here. JJ, tell us in a sentence or two or three, Pat Patterson.
Pat was one of, if not the greatest mind for wrestling of anybody that I've ever been around. That's pretty strong praise. But he, did extremely well with Ray Stevens, with Roy Shire in Frisco. And Pat was a student of the business. And when they went to work for Vern in Minneapolis, it was an extension of the same thing. That Pat, to me, of all the people that I've ever been around that were wrestlers, I don't throw the word genius around very much, but to me, Pat Patterson was a genius about our business, and a great performer that drew money everywhere that he ever was. He was respected by which is not always the case by guys that work on the office side of it. Everybody respected Pat, and every year for WrestleMania, Vince would have his match set for WrestleMania, and a lot of the success of the WrestleMania event was surrounded about getting the right two guys and having the right match. And Vince used to take the two guys that were in a main event, and he would get a secluded place somewhere, set a ring up where there was no traffic through there. It was very, very private. And he would send Pat for a week, and then they would work out the WrestleMania match. And Vince had total confidence in Pat to lay everything out. And the guys that were in the business respected Pat's knowledge, business, and the way he approached people. He was just perfect at what he did, and a friend.
What about Leo Burke?
Leo Burke was one of the greatest talents. If I wouldn't start naming others, but if I had to pick the 5 greatest talents that I was ever in the ring with in my career, and I had 3,200 matches, one of those 5 would be Leo Burke. He was that good. He could do anything in the ring. And one of the reasons that he didn't get the reputation and the recognition for how great he was is because he moved around a lot and wrestled under different names. He was Tommy Martin in Kansas City. He was Leo Burke somewhere else, and something. And that was sad because he could have had a legacy with just one name based on what he could do in the ring. He was one of the greatest guys that I ever wrestled. Doing 60 minutes with him was something that I always regarded as a proud accomplishment because that's how good he was.
And Leo Burke is he's a long time personal friend of mine.
Just a great guy.
Just a great guy. What can I say about the great Leo Burke? And But I have one final guy to ask you about here, JJ, and then how about the great Johnny Valentine?
Johnny Valentine, I think I already said when I started, it was the era of Argentina Rocca, Chief Big Heart, Carl Von Hess, Skull Murphy and Brute Bernard were a tag team. And Johnny Valentine, he's hard to verbalize a description that does him adequate justice. He, as a fan, I would watch him, and John never wore these big flashy robes or jackets. He would come out to the ring. He was tall, good-looking guy, good body, and he could climb up, walk down the apron, and have somebody boo, and he would look, and he could like stare holes in people, and he got more reaction or response out of less than I think any other talent that I've ever been around in the business. And in the ring, he could do anything. He could do anything. And like I say, when I was a kid, I had a fan club for him. And even before I was more inside the business where I knew a lot of the workings, I recognized him as being somebody special, even though at that point I didn't understand why he was special. Because he didn't do flashy interviews, didn't dress flashy, but I remember the little things. You know, he would take somebody and he would drape them back over the top rope, and he would bring that forearm down across their chest, and sweat would fly, and there'd be a big welt across their chest. And the people would just go, you'd hear a moan from the people that what he did was so solid and believable. And he expected people that worked with him to hit him as hard as he hit them. He never hurt anybody, but he just was very physical, and he looked the part. And I think was really big part of why he was so successful. He was physical.
Did you ever run across Kurt von Poppenheim when you were starting out? He was only usually in the Portland area, but I know he did a little bit. Okay. Yeah, we have a fan who wants to know if you have any memories of Angelo Mosca.
Big Nasty. Yeah. Angelo was a character, and he was a great football player and had a great run in Florida. I'm trying to think of how the story went. He used to like to rib. And Kevin Sullivan was there, and Kevin was, anyway, in Tampa, they had a stall shower with a frosted glass front. And so Mosca went in to shower, and Kevin Sullivan, and I don't know how it got started, but Kevin Sullivan, and he had his pants draped over the thing. Kevin Sullivan took a pair of scissors and took one leg and cut through him and cut it off at the knee. And I laugh about it now because it wasn't me. And Mosca did it to Sullivan. That's what it was. And cut half his pant leg off. And he came out and he looked, and of course Kevin was snickering. He thought that was the funniest thing in the world. Mosca didn't snap or didn't say anything, but a week later, I think it was, let's see, it was Mosca that did it, and then the week later, Mosca always had really, really nice clothes, Italian silk pants and Italian handmade shoes. And Mosca went in to get to a shower, And Kevin Sullivan, that had one pant leg cut off the week before, took a pair of very expensive Italian loafers, put them in the middle of the floor, goes in his bag, gets a can of Renuzit or whatever it is that used to fill Zippo lighters with, and shh in the one shoe and shh in the other. And right as the shower stopped and Moscow was about to open the door, Kevin threw a match in there, and immediately the flames went up, and Moscow came out and said, my shoes are on fire. That's the problem, which is I never got into ribbing for that reason, because the minute that you pulled a rib that you thought was really funny at that point, if you really thought about it, you're going to get ribbed back. And if you can't laugh as hard when somebody does that to you, no matter how serious it is, then don't get involved in it. And that's what I never got involved with ribbing for that reason.
I got Michael Allen Rubin is wondering what your thoughts are on AEW and how long before you're going to be in the front office
of what
AEW.
And what is AEW?
I love it.
AEW is the new wrestling promotion that is on cable television. It's run by Cody Rhodes, I believe.
Oh, okay. I'd
never heard of it either, JJ. Don't feel bad.
Let me just say that one person in the business who was my arch nemesis that I battled with and spilled blood for and was involved in bloody matches was Dusty Rhodes, his father. And yet Dusty was the booker, I was his assistant, and we were not only professionally connected in that sense, but became very, very close personal friends, that because of people seeing us on opposite side of the rings, it was something that we never socialized where anybody could see the two of us together. The only time was at Christmas. Michelle would always have a Christmas party with just close people in the business, and Michelle and Dusty insisted that I attend as their guest, and which I did, and it was the only time that we ever socialized, and it was in a setting where there was nobody there that could say, hey, they're really the best of friends kind of thing. But I had so much respect for him, and he treated me so kindly. And when Dusty passed, I was devastated. That's how close we were. He just when you work that close with somebody, and I remember we were in Florida, and I always was hoping to somehow be an owner of a promotion at some point. And the promotion that I'd worked for when I first got my break up in the Maritimes contacted me, and the guy that was the ring announcer owned an ad agency and wanted to start back up, contacted me by coming in to line up all the talent, set everything up with the TVs and whatever. And Dusty and Eddie Graham gave me carte blanche to go through all their video libraries and put together a series of 10 weeks of TV that I recorded there with ins and outs to send up there as a prelude before I went up there. And when I went up there, it was a deal that the promoter that used to be with Rudy Kay, who was a guy who thought he understood the business and thought he was a big deal in the business, and his name is Al Zink, was partners. And Al was the kind of guy that the guys kind of laughed under their breath at him, but Al thought he was the big deal, where the reason it was successful was because Rudy was running everything and handling all the talent. So I get up there, and the commentator has Al Zink involved, and they flew me up to Halifax to have a meeting, and I went by the Forum with Al Zink, and he had no talent lined up, and this guy that had been the announcer had a very successful business with an ad agency doing advertising, and he was going to fund everything.
And I was going to say, JJ, when we were talking about Johnny Valentine, could you tell us what do you think of Greg the Hammer following in Johnny's footsteps?
Yeah, I just want to finish the story. When I got up there, I could see that the guy that promised to give them a television show didn't deliver, and it was the beginning of the infancy of cable television up in the Maritimes. And what they gave him was an hour show on cable television that was in its infancy, that the number of eyeballs looking at it, that it didn't have a prayer of. And instead of bringing a lot of talent up there, guaranteeing them, I told the guy, I said, I'm going to cut this off right now. I said, because you're about to lose everything, and I don't want you to lose your house, your business, that this guy doesn't know what he's doing, and it's not set up to be successful. And I don't need the money to come up here and take your money. I don't know what anybody else is going to do. And it ended up the guy folded it, which it would have been nice if it had worked out, but it wasn't meant to be. And I know that I did the right thing, and it wasn't like I didn't have a place to go or whatever. What was the question that you were asking about Greg Valentine?
Yeah, Greg, what as far as Greg Valentine, if you could tell us a few words, if he followed your opinion on Greg Valentine's career, following up in the footsteps of his father.
Yeah, if you look at Greg, and if you've ever seen Johnny, you know that Greg is Johnny's son. That's for sure. And his style is very much mirrors that of his father. He doesn't have the height and size that his father did, but Greg was very, very accomplished and one of the success stories in our business. And I've worked with him, worked around him, and I consider him a friend as well.
We got a lot of fans in the chat asking about your memories of the Sportatorium and the Von Erichs.
That was great. I went with Archie, which was my beginning of my I never managed before. And Archie called me and he said, I've got a top spot in Dallas, need a manager. Okay, I'll come in. I go there. And at that point, Fritz owned, I want to say he owned the Sportatorium. He actually owned it. And so when they ran, the big money maker was the concessions. And of course the kids were young, running around, probably eating up half the profits with rating the. So long story short, I saw the kids from being little brats to all of them growing up. The one that was the most mature of them all was David, and I became good friends with David and was around him for quite a bit. Kerry was a great athlete. I think he had a state shot put record, but just didn't have, other than the physique, have the skill levels that David did. And Fritz was wonderful to work with. He was still working at the time, and I remember when I first went in there, I went in there with Sakurada, Kendo Nagasaki, and Mr. Hito and I managed them. And I remember getting into a situation where I was forced to get into a match with two of the Von Erich boys, and they they would run around like crazy in the ring, like they had their hair on fire, and you were having to just watch what everything was going, because they would run and dive and jump, and you never knew. I don't think they knew where they were going to land, and if you were anywhere near the landing site, you had to take care of yourself. But I remember one time they turnbuckled Hito, and or Sakurada first because he was the taller, then Hito, and Fritz followed them in, and he's got them sandwiched behind him in the corner holding the top rope, and he's looking at me and he's going like this, and I'm thinking, where am I going to go? And finally it was like, okay, I get the message. And of course, as I ran across, I got that size 15 boot hit me in the chest and knocked all the wind out of me. Fritz but he was over. And when he put that call on, Fritz was over and the call was over.
Well, I think this has been a heck of a show here.
Yeah, Matt, listen, just before I've got
a few more.
I've got a couple more here. I'd like to, if I could, just before I know we're running out of time. I've got a question here from a wrestling promoter in Akron, Ohio. His name is Rick. From RCW Wrestling. He's a regular attendee at the Cauliflower Alley Club. He said he's met the great JJ Dillon many times. He's asking, JJ, what is your best advice to an up-and-coming guy who's just breaking into the wrestling business in 2020? Rick Lee.
Well, the business isn't what it used to be. And back in the territory days, the advantage was that you had maybe 25 places around the country, each of which employed 12 to 15 wrestlers, and the wrestlers, there'd be always like there was Ricky Romero and Amarillo and Bob Geigel's buddy in Kansas City that there were homesteaders, and we're over in the territories, but you could go from territory to territory, and my style was such that when I came in, I wasn't flashy. I didn't have that gym workout type of body. So it took me a little bit longer to get over, but my style was such that once I got over, I also stayed over for a long time and could get a hell of a run, which was usually like a year. And so when I would come in, I would get over and be able to stay. And in the business at that time, when you were going from territory to territory, that was a pretty good way to have your career set up, because other guys that would come in for 6 weeks had to stay in a hotel, would run their course and then have to move on, and didn't have the advantage that I have of being able to come, especially if you had a family with kids in school. So I was very lucky that most moves that I made, I would come in. Took me a little while to get over, but then I got over, stayed over, and could pretty well stay a year. And then I always knew when was time to move on while I still was over, so that I could come back at a later date and have another run. So I had a great career.
And I have one final question. This is from a dear friend of ours. He's another Cauliflower Alley Club attendee. He's a very good friend of a good friend of mine who's always putting you over. I tell you, this guy, I've never heard of anybody put JJ Dillon over than the guy who was going to bring up. A few words about the great man, Bret Hart.
Bret Hart was he could do anything. He could do everything. And he was the leader of the Hart family, and was a main eventer anywhere and everywhere that he ever went, and just a total credit to our business, and a true legend. and somebody who I regard as a close personal friend. And I don't throw praise around. Very, very selective about the praise that I give for people in the business. I have a lot of people that I consider associates that I've been with, enjoyed being around, made money with. But in terms of a small group of people that I would consider elite people in the business that are my friends, Bret Hart would be on that group.
Just before we, I know him back in the day when Stu Hart was alive. He would always tell me, he says, one of his, he always had such great regard for the great JJ Dillon. And Stu told me that many times, JJ. So I just wanted to leave.
He always said JJ was one of the smartest guys he ever met in the business, a great mind, and he wished there was more JJ Dillons, because the business would be a hell of a lot better.
Wow, that's God, I'm humbled by hearing that, especially coming from a true legend in Stu Hart. And I wanted, before my career ended back in the day, to have gone to all the major territories, and Calgary was one of them. And they had long trips up there. And so there was a tour that I made in Japan where I went with Kendo Nagasaki and Sakurada. And on the way back, I spent a week, got booked for a week in Calgary, and got to work the towns and be around Stu that week and Helen, and got a chance to go to the mansion and hear all the stories about this big staircase like going from the wind, and the murals of their children that were on the side walls that were just huge. And I just felt that my career would never have been complete if I didn't at least spend a week in Calgary to be around.
I remember, JJ, when you were up in 1980, I believe, and Stu, I remember he and Leo Burke used to talk about the great minds in the business and the guys who were really got it and all, and your name was always up at the top of the list. And Leo, as you know, had incredible respect for you too, and he and my dad used to just talk about how impressed they were with you and just your common sense approach and your grasp of ring psychology and all like that. And so I know my dad had great respect and high regard for you.
And I felt the same way about Leo. And I was never the biggest, never the best, didn't have that bodybuilding physique. But what I did was have a passion for the business, and would never have ever done anything or been involved in anything that embarrassed or demeaned the business. And with whatever talent that God did give me, everywhere that I ever went, no matter how big the crowd was or how small the crowd was, I always in the back of my mind said that if tickets were $5 and you're in an arena one night where there's 2,000 people there, it's easy to go out in front of 2,000 people because the energy that gets generated with that is one thing. But to go to a small town, whether the TV didn't air that week and got preempted or something, and maybe they didn't put out as much publicity as they should, and you go to a small town and there's 100, 150 people there. Well, I always had the attitude that each one of those people paid that same $5 or $10, whatever the number was, to buy a ticket to come see me perform. And if I didn't go out there and put forth the same effort in front of that group of people as I did in front of the people where there was 5,000 in the arena, then it would have been time to get out of the business, and I didn't deserve to be in the business of that. And so I always gave my best effort, so that I didn't want anybody ever to say that they had ever bought a ticket, went to an event, saw me, and were disappointed by what they saw. I would have been devastated if that, and I worked hard to keep that from ever happening with the talent that God did give me. And I like I said, I had 3,200 matches over a 20-year period. And I think I worked as hard in the last one as I did in the first one.
And JJ, I want to thank, on behalf of Matt Mers and Shawn and of course Bruce and myself, we'd like to thank you. You're one of the you're probably the most respected guy I know in the wrestling business, and love talking to you. I've talked to you for hours, and we'd love to have you join us again on the Hart Beat on YouTube. We just kind of touched on it tonight. We'd love to have you back.
I would love to come back, get a little break. You know, I don't want the people to get tired of hearing me, but I've been blessed to have had a lengthy career, been everywhere, done everything that I ever could have wanted to do. You know, I dreamed of going to Japan, going to Australia, wrestling in Madison Square Garden, and did all those things. And the main thing that I say that I was never the biggest, never the best, but what I can say is that no one ever loved the business more than I did, or was willing to work as hard as I would and did, given the talent that God gave me. And when my career is over and I never ever get near a ring again, you know, I can lay my head down that last night knowing that as kind as the wrestling profession was to me, to give me so many memories and travels around the world and give me whatever material possessions I have, that I tried to give back with everything that I possibly could. And I just that's been my philosophy, and I still feel that way.
Next time, I'd love to take a tour of your memorabilia you have. Just talk about some of it.
I've had to be selective, but I got quite a few things here, and those I can't tell you the times that I have family things on the farm on the other wall, and it's like a great room that God's probably, I don't know, 25, 30 feet long, and it's like postage stamps on a puzzle of all the pictures of memories of places I went and the people that I've been with, and I can't tell you the times that I just sit and look, and am so happy that I had a chance, and that so many people helped me along the way, because I never could have done it on my own.
Bruce, do you have any final words here tonight?
I just love to thank JJ, and I'd like to commend him for the contributions he's made to our business. Class act in every way, and I've never heard anything but great things said about him, and JJ's more than lived up to all my high expectations today, you know, and I'm honored and privileged that JJ took time from his schedule to join us today, and I hope some of the young wrestlers maybe learn from his words of wisdom. So just thanks for the incredible career, JJ, and thanks for the memories. Nothing but respect and praise from the Hart family, and you're one of the best, and thank you for everything you've done for our business.
And I thank you. I thank you back for all that you've done, and for this program where you allow old timers like me to come on and relive some of the stories of places we've been and things we've done, and it just reinforces why professional wrestling is truly the greatest business in the world.
Well, I'll close it out here, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank Bruce Hart, Bob Johnson, Shawn Bryant, and James J. Dillon, and of course, all of the beautiful people in Webtown who tuned in to watch this. We will see you next weekend for another edition of the Hart Beat. Good night.
Thank you, JJ.
Thank you.